Thank you. Ready? Okay. Welcome everyone to our latest Ardavan Academy event. Ardavan Academy, for those of you who don't know, is a campus community of mostly faculty, we've got a few students as well, who are interested in advancing the goals of viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement. So, to pursue that mission, one of the things we do is host events like this. We try to have a range of different opinions, people engaging in the clash of the dialects, try to get a range of perspectives that sometimes aren't often heard on campus, and students don't get to hear that much articulated. So today's topic is about K-12 education. Some of you may notice this is very similar to an event we had back in June. Now, at that event, we had mostly one speaker, Stephen, who talked, and he laid out his idea of a couple of different competing policy visions, sort of the traditional science of learning approach to education versus the new, I guess, social justice approach to education. But it was really, from his perspective, rather one-sided. And so we're very grateful that we now have another perspective. Dr. Eizadirad is here to really articulate that perspective from someone, I think, who really is a proponent, believes in that. And that's really how you should do things, not have someone articulate what they think the other perspective is. So we're really excited about that. Before I begin, I'd like to articulate what we call the HxA way, which is how we like to do things at Ardavan Academy. So first of all, make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and of course, be yourself. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to allow each speaker to talk for about 10 minutes. They each have a short slideshow, hopefully around 10 minutes. And then we will open it up amongst the three to ask one another questions. I might ask an occasional question or moderate. And we'll maybe do that for, 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and hopefully be done by around 8:30. So I'll just quickly introduce each speaker. So Stephen Reich will be our first speaker. Stephen is a PhD candidate researcher.
Student, actually. I haven't done my comps yet.
Oh, okay. So wow, that's a big difference, isn't it? Stephen Reich, okay, so he's a PhD student investigating the growing influence of anti-oppression activism, anti-racism, decolonization, and social justice in K-12 education, mostly at the expense of approaches validated by learning science, a trend that has accelerated during the progressive conservatives' tenure here at Ontario. He will discuss how to better the education system based on his research. Professor Ardavan Eizadirad is an education scholar whose research is grounded in anti-oppression activism, anti-racism, decolonization, and social justice. He will discuss how to better the education system based on his research. And finally, Scott Davies is a sociologist of education who employs large-scale quantitative research to survey the various directions educational policy has historically taken and the implications of those directions on school boards, schools, and student achievement. He will discuss situating what he perceives as the current hegemony of social justice in the context of educational reform historically. So we'll start off with Stephen.
All right. There we go. Oops. There we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. As it says there, my take. So the first question I think that it's always important to ask when we're talking about policy is, what is the purpose of public education? And so I'm going to give you my take. To me, I think the purpose of public education is to take the dependent child, the child who, is a child, and through training, then release them at 18 after grade 12 as an independent adult. That's the role of education. And in terms of what education is doing, it's doing training. And we want to move that dependent child from being a novice, someone who doesn't know anything, to an advanced beginner, to being competent in knowledge, to being proficient, and then ultimately to be an expert. Because it's only once you're an expert that you can actually critically think about something. You can't critically think about stuff that you don't know anything about. The what of education. So, in my view, we should take the most consequential knowledge accumulated by humanity to date, plus the skills to manipulate that knowledge, and that's what the content should be. And that would be decided democratically, or by panels of experts with consultation. But we want the most consequential knowledge accumulated by date because humanity has produced an incredible amount of knowledge that is important and that is consequential in the sense that it helps us better the world, move forward, solve problems, make the human condition better. The why of education, what's its purpose? So, assuming that we do it this way, the first purpose is competence in adult functioning. We also want to provide room for personal growth and fulfillment. Education provides that. For advancing knowledge and innovation, so that we go further. Finding solutions to humanity's problems. National identity and cohesion. And along with national identity and cohesion comes civic responsibility and duty. Because if you hate Canada as a country, you're not going to feel any responsibility to your fellow citizens in order to solve the problems that Canada has and to advance us into the future. Otherwise, if we don't have this, what is the replacement? Now, there could be other replacements. It could be your province, it could be your city, it could be a smaller neighborhood or a community. But the fact is that ultimately we have to have some pride in something that we all belong to that unites us in order to have that sense of civic responsibility and duty. The how of education. So what I propose is that we want curriculum and pedagogy, and for those of you who don't know, pedagogy is just a fancy word for teaching. We want it to be based on replicable quantitative research and not fads, myths, and unproven theories that someone came up with in the ivory towers, right? And why do we want that? We want it so that it's efficient, so that it's socioeconomically resilient. Right? The problem with the education system that we have now is that so much is left, for the child to discover on their own, but practically that means that the parents, and middle-class parents tend to do this, is they manage their children's education. They do their homework with them, they might even do their homework for them, they hire tutors, and I say you have to design a system around, imagine the single parent working 3 jobs in a 1-bedroom apartment with their children, and they don't have time. Right? They're trying to put food on the table. They don't have time to do their kids' homework, and they don't have money to hire tutors. So that means that the work has to be done in school, right? Not projects to do at home. And that way, we get rid of the tutoring industrial complex, and we have actual equity in terms of all children beginning at the same place. So what we really want, what I'm talking about is equality of opportunity. We're going to talk about the difference between equality of opportunity and equity in a second. And we want measurable results of durable knowledge acquisition. That's the important part. You'll often hear people talk about, standardized testing or whatever. The issue is not standardized testing. The issue is that if you learn something, okay, so let's say you learned something here, and 6 months later you're asked about it and you don't remember anything about it, then it was a waste of time. So, learning science provides us with the plan so that you learn something and you continue to remember it, you deepen it, you learn more about it, so that a year later you still remember it. That way the teacher, the following grade, let's say moving from grade 3 to 4, doesn't have to repeat all the lessons you did in grade 3 because none of the kids remember. So, I see this as there's two models of education really, and they're non-compatible. The first is the cognitive science-based, which is what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is where we look at experimental science, which has basically been consistent over the last 50 years about telling us the best and most equitable way to make sure that all children learn something and retain that knowledge so that they can apply it in new situations. The second one is constructivist, and that's based on a theory that children naturally are curious and can teach themselves and that they construct their own realities. And that can be divided into discovery inquiry-based learning, which is where you do your own projects, etc. And then we've got critical theory or identity-based education, which is now a gloss put on constructivism about social justice, that while the kids are doing their own projects, the goal of that is that they should be strengthening their identity to ally with other marginalized groups so that they can overthrow the system. Okay, why are these two models incompatible? This is why. Cognitive science, the teacher is the source of knowledge based on the teacher's expertise. The teacher is an expert both in the subject matter that they're teaching and in the pedagogy that's required for that subject matter to go into the children and for them to actually remember it so that they can apply it in the future. For constructivists and critical theorists, children themselves are the sources of knowledge based on their lived experience. And that's basically based on sort of the writings of Rousseau and the idea that, that civilization is corrupting, that if we just, left children alone in nature, they would discover things. Well, of course, we have no evidence for that because we can't take a newborn baby and remove them from their family and throw them into the woods and see what happens, right? So we don't know that that's actually the case, and it seems to be, why would children know anything about algebra? There are certain things biologically that we are programmed to learn on our own, how to walk, how to talk, although you do have to be around other people talking that language, but not math, not reading, those things are too recent. Human beings have only been doing that for a few thousand years. So we have not yet evolved a natural ability to learn that. And that's been tested. The teacher, under cognitive science, is responsible for directing the instructional activities. That means it's completely teacher designed and teacher centered. The teacher is the expert, the focus of the classroom. Under a constructivist method, children are responsible for their own learning and teachers are just the guide on the side to guide them. Under cognitive science-based methods, there's actually a system for transferring knowledge to long-term memory. Right? So cognitive science understands that you have a limited capacity in your working memory to accumulate various facts. They say, kind of 7 bits of information. Now, if you don't know something, if I give you a task and you're not already an expert in it, you haven't been exposed to it, no background knowledge in it, you're just working with your working memory. That is exhausting. So if you have too many tasks that are related, children give up. Not just children, adults as well. Like if I threw a classical piece of music and you never learned how to read music, whatever, you're going to be, how do I do this, right? So it involves a lot of practice and a lot of feedback. That means not a single piece of work that you do, everything is marked, reviewed with you to correct for misunderstandings and to make sure you're on the right track. And it needs to be retrieved at regular intervals, right? So at first you might retrieve it initially, then you move on to another subject, but then you have to keep retrieving it all throughout the year in a grade so that you remember it, right? Eventually, if you keep doing that, it's in your long-term memory and it's in there forever, right? It can't be lost. Cognitive science-based, it's expert design by people who know what they're doing, and it's logically sequenced. So, for example, in the curriculum now, they've added algebra to grade 1. I mean, think about it. How can you do algebra if you don't know your multiplication tables and you don't know how to do long division? It's ridiculous. So what? So they're going to, throw, a triangle on the page and say, remember this is a triangle, this is a circle, this is a, that's not algebra. So let's not delude ourselves. You can't do algebra until you're an expert in foundational knowledge, which is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and long division, and to be able to do it in your head. Logically sequenced. Constructivist critical methods, self-designed projects, right? They're usually very broad-based. The kids can choose whatever they want to do. And generally, this, in reality, takes the form, because, kids they figure it out, right? You go to, let's leave AI aside, because AI is a whole new thing. But they go to Google, they go to Wikipedia, they copy the information from Wikipedia, they post it onto slides, they reword it, they take the references at the end of the Wikipedia article, they run it through a computer, very easy to find, so APA 7, now they've got it, they put that in, they get some Google images, they populate their slides with the Google images. If they're really creative, they'll add some music to it, whatever, they get 4 out of 4 on the teacher rubric, right? Have the kids learned anything? No, nothing. You ask them 6 months later, what do you know about this topic? They don't know anything about it. So it's like, it's fake. It's just a waste of time. We could eliminate it altogether. If that's what we're going to do, let's give the kids recess instead. And that's why, under the constructivist method, they talk about spiraling education. Because you're not going anywhere, right? You're going around the bathtub drain in circles. You keep revisiting the same thing. I watched it with my son. Like, again, you're doing that again, and now the next year you're doing it again, and then you're doing it again, because none of it sinks in. Under cognitive science, it's subject matter focused. And you go from the basics to mastery. That's where you want to get to. You want to master the subject. And the reason is because once you master that subject, you can critically think about it. So if you learn about, let's say, the history of Indigenous nations in Ontario prior to European contact, right? So you learn about it, you learn the history, you learn the languages they spoke, you learn about, the various historical events, the wars that happened, the development of agriculture, who took over who. I mean, these are fantastic, interesting stories. Well, now that the kids know something, they can think about it, right? But if you just give them sort of like a, that the Indigenous people were here and they were oppressed and whatever, how's a kid supposed to critically think about that? They have no knowledge about it, other than now they're just repeating what you said, right? So that's why it's important. Under constructivist critical methods, everything they look at is cross-curricular, right? It's all, we add everything into everything, and we believe that there's a generalized critical thinking. Well, they've tested this. There is not. You can't critically think about anything generally. You actually have to have knowledge in each subject domain. Now, once you become an expert in those subject domains, then you can apply your thinking and make the linkages between those subjects. But you can't do that without having a lot of knowledge about the various subjects. Cognitive science-based methods. The focus is on building humanity's existing knowledge as a schema, like a system of putting it together in narratives in the child's brain, right? Where it stays in long-term memory so that they can use that knowledge to manipulate it for new situations. Constructivist critical methods, the focus is on, at least according to what they say, on dismantling existing knowledge. And you'll often hear the word decolonizing the mind. Well, scientifically, unless you have a traumatic brain injury, you can't remove information from your head. So other than saying that as a theory, or because that's the words of today, whatever, you can't actually do it. So why pretend? Under cognitive science-based methods, the focus is on the world outside your window. Like, let's not assume that everybody is upper middle class and their parents take them to the museum and the library and they read to them or whatever. For the kid who doesn't have that experience for whatever, like, this is an opportunity for them to be exposed to worlds they never knew, but for all children, like worlds in the past, worlds from different cultures, worlds from literature, from history. Like, it's to open the window, to present them with opportunities. Under constructivist critical methods, the focus is on the self. It's all about your self-reflection, how you've been harmed, how you've been hurt. You know what the research says about that? That's a great way to produce mental illnesses. Cognitive science-based methods, the focus is on human commonalities, right? We want peace, don't we? We want people to get along. We want people to treat each other fairly. We have to focus on human commonalities, even when we explore the differences, right? And the differences are explored with respect, because we learn about what is in a culture. We don't divide people into social groups and then attribute that, this, if you look like this, you're an avatar for this, and this is what you must believe, and this is what you are, and this is what your experience is. It's just not true. And constructivist critical methods, that is the focus. It's on human differences and grievances, identity, right? And there's a term, like identity used to be a psychological term to describe your personality, how you understand yourself as a human being. Well, now it's become like, you know, you have to silo yourself into these predetermined social groups, and then that becomes the basis for where you are on the intersectional ladder of oppression, and whether or not you're oppressed. And then the more oppressed you are, you get more resources. Like, is that going to be good for national unity? Is that, and we're going to talk about the result of that because it has been tested. So, proof of cognitive science's success. After teacher quality, meta-analyses say it's the most efficient, most effective for academic achievement for everybody. It eliminates, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, 95 to 98% of dyslexia diagnoses, which means that most of the kids that have learning disabilities tied to dyslexia, it's because it's NBT. They've never been taught. That's what they have, right? If you teach it properly, they're not going to have dyslexia. It reduces the need for individual education plans so that the students who actually need those services get the resources, not the middle class kids, so that, you know, they'll get an A+ because they got extra time on the test. It's the most effective at closing gaps between high and low achievers. Again, Hattie, meta-analyses looking at hundreds of studies. It eliminates the need for remediation, accommodations, tutoring, extra help. Again, Carol was a study in Australia where they took an entire school board and they said, we are going to only implement cognitive, we're getting rid of discovery learning, we're not doing the critical social justice stuff. We want to see, does this make a difference in low income neighborhoods? And it was a huge difference. They did the same kind of study in Scotland. The kids in reading were and this is from poor neighborhoods, they were 3.5 years ahead of their middle class peers, just by using scientifically proven methods. It raises class average regardless of your socioeconomic level. It's the best preparation for higher order math. Again, these are studies with controls. On global PISA tests, science students taught through cognitive science-based methods score significantly better than those taught through inquiry-based methods. Lasting effects, especially for low SES children because their parents can't afford to get them tutors. Let's talk about critical pedagogy success. And so there were a few American researchers. This research does not go on in Canada. They actually tested. Like, they came out with, let's look at, you know, some critical pedagogy. Let's look at how it's been applied in classrooms in the United States. Does it improve academic achievement? Like, what does it actually do? And they looked at other measures as well. And these were big studies. Like, we're talking tens of thousands of students. Okay, so here's what they found. Students end up believing that you can divide the world into oppressors and the oppressed. Students believe that science is a myth. And along with that there's no such thing as reality, right? So everyone has their own truth, and you know, so we have no common place to have dialogue. Students believe that revolution is a moral imperative. Students feel that they don't belong in society, and this was particularly terrible, and John McWhorter writes about this, that particularly for Black students, and particularly for the males, that they feel, what's the point? Like, why should I even bother? This society hates me, it's a white supremacy, I'm never going to get ahead, everything is against me, why should I even try? Right? That's a lovely result. Some ethnicities are excluded, so in a classroom that was, for example, a number of classrooms in the States where they did this, where it was a majority, let's say, African-American class with some Latinos, the Latinos felt like no one cares about them because the focus was on the Black students, right? If they did in a Latino classroom and there were Brazilians, the Brazilians felt like no one cares about us. No one cares about our success. This is all about them, not about us. And what did it do? It fueled resentment. That's a great result. And finally, no effect on academic achievement. A new study just came out, just this week, about the effects of DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, the kind of training that's done in businesses, the kind of training that we now have in our provincial curriculum, the board's promoted, it's, you know, your kids are being taught it, teachers are forced to teach it, and they wanted to see, you know, does it actually reduce bias that people have toward each other. No, you know what it does? It actually creates bias where none existed before. So that it makes people actually look at a situation and say, oh, there was racism there was ableism there, even when it was a completely neutral situation. And they did that by having people read texts by D'Angelo and Ibram X. Kendi and stuff about anti-racism and global white supremacy, and then they were given a neutral thing. They weren't told anything about the people in the story. It was just person A, person B, and they read those stories as like horrible racism, right? The people who read a story about corn farming read the same neutral story and just, they didn't see it. So, and this is coming out of Rutgers University. I looked at which policy model is the Ministry of Education promoting here in Ontario. And I looked at 700 ministry documents, policy documents, curricular documents from the 1980s till 2022. So in the blue, we have all the critical pedagogy stuff. So you can see there's none of it before 2007, which makes sense because the big scholars who wrote about it were writing about it. Geneva Gay was in 2002 until it finally leaked into Canada. It was 2007, and you can see it just goes up and up. And you know, basically, this would be the Liberal government, and this is the Conservative government over here. In the light green, that's the science-based pedagogy. So you can see we're already at a low base because they were already doing inquiry-based learning in the mid-1990s, and then it just disappears. So by 2022. It's not in our government's policy at all. The ministry's promotion of critical theory and pedagogy over time, that over time from 1982 to 2022, a 1,730% increase in critical theory terms in the curriculum and teacher resources, 1,825% increase in all the terms relating to critical pedagogy since 2002. And the results. So, without getting in, I mean, you basically can see this is from PISA, and say what you like about standardized testing. Standardized testing has been tested for bias. It's not true. It's a myth that it's culturally biased. That it doesn't work. These tests are formulated for the country in which they're given, and they are tested. They are pre-tested to make sure that they eliminate any kind of bias that is supposed to be there. So that is actually not true. There's lots of studies that say that. But in any event, look at Ontario. How did 15-year-old students do? Math, reading, science. The direction is not good. There's math, 2003 to 2018. No good. And if you're wondering, what about the rest of the world? Well, the American Critical Pedagogy Project has spread all over the developed world. And these are the trends. So when you see, Ontario and Canada, they're right near the averages of all the other OECD countries. That's true. But let's look at all the OECD countries. And let's see what's happened once they adopted American pedagogy. And where are they going? Is this what we want? I don't think so. Let science tell us what works most equitably for all children. And that's what I'm promoting. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. So my name is Ardavan Eizadirad. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Ed here. My presentation is going to be like us going to marriage therapy and merging the two. It's not this or this. It's how do you take the best out of each to meet the needs of our students, because we have diverse students. So how many of you remember a positive teacher you had from K-12? Put your hand up. Okay, let's hear one or two reasons of why you remember that teacher, whoever feels comfortable.
Strict.
Strict? Okay, there's little details like.
High expectations.
Okay, thank you. Someone else?
Talk to me on playground.
So talk to you, so saw you for who you are, okay, and.
Organized and had high expectations of me.
Okay, organized and high expectation, which work, one more?
I felt like the teacher cared about me more than just as a student, but also as a person.
Okay. How many of you remember a shitty teacher you had? Okay, now let's hear the reasons for that.
You read Sports Illustrated during class.
Okay, and that didn't vibe with you?
You didn't vibe with anybody, you didn't learn anything.
Okay, so during instructional time, you're talking, okay, got it. All right, yes,
I was more concerned about being friendly.
more about being friendly, got it. And yes,
Outwardly sexist.
okay, so inappropriate. Okay, good. So keep those in mind. I mean, a lot of them is some of those were curriculum related or expectations, and some of them were
Teacher-related, I would say.
teacher related. Okay, it's up with interpretation, but and some of them were more about the environment you create, the care and how you feel, right? So my entry point into the conversation is going to be different, and this has changed over time. Let's replace the word EDI, because I don't per se agree with everything within the EDI discourse. There's quite a few differences. Terms like decolonization and white supremacy are used loosely. We have to define it. So I want us to replace EDI with the term creating the best systems. I think that's what we all want, because obviously we're not happy with the current system. But best can be subjective. So for me, the term best is how do you meet the needs of different learners in the context of K-12 education, right? So some of the examples, high expectations, organization, right? Those are meeting the needs of people. But some people have helicopter parents. They're actually micromanaged too much, so you actually need to give them a little breathing room as a teacher, right? So I taught kindergarten, I've taught middle school, I've taught high school, I taught college before I transitioned to university. So the art of teaching, and I think you were talking a lot about the science of it, that there's an art and a science, and they have to merge. That's what makes the best teachers. It's recognizing how do you merge the two, and some of it we try to teach. You know, if you are become an Ontario certified teacher, you go to a 2-year program, it used to be 1 year. But some of it also is a bit of trial and error, right? You're trying to see, you know, what does the student like and how do you build it in? I've done a lot of community work and I try to bring that into the school system. I think you have to remember school is a microism of the community, right? What's in community is gonna spill into schools and vice versa. And not every community has the same needs. Some are impacted more by violence, right? Some have more poverty. So you can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. So how do the question we want to leave at the conversation is, how do we try to meet the different needs of different communities and different schools, but yet have a strong common core, whether it's the curriculum, it's the teacher training, that positions us to get the best, right? So for me, the question is always, how do we create thriving communities? That's my entry point. Sometimes maybe it's EDI, sometimes maybe it's the high expectations, but that's going to be different for every school and for every community. And if we don't actually map out their needs, then it's like rolling the dice, we're guessing. And that means we have to also create spaces that the community, whether it's the students, the teachers, the parents, the policymakers, the teachers, they're all part of some of that conversation, right? I think EDI is misread a lot. Nobody's asking for handouts, which is sometimes how it's positioned, and I think that's detrimental to the conversation. But how do we mitigate barriers to getting access to opportunities, which is something you mentioned. We want equality of outcome, which is idealistic, because not everybody will be a student, right? So how do we make the failing student a passive student, and then maybe push up to a D or a C or a B, right? You can't expect success to be overnight, right? So I think from this entry point, at least some of the conversations we had setting up, we agree a lot more than we disagree. But it's very nuanced and it's complex, right? I 100% agree. Our decisions should be data-driven, right? But also data can argue either way, right? A lot of things you presented, I think they're correlational, they're not causations, right? Because there's a lot of factors in the lives of students and teachers and the community that can impact whether someone is engaged. I can have high expectations for a student, but if they're in an abusive home environment, they don't eat, right? All of those things makes it more difficult, doesn't make it impossible, right? So the language of community safety and social work is risk factors and protective factors, right? It's a game of probabilities. The more risk factors you're exposed to, the more likely you are to gravitate towards criminality, crime, making poor decisions. The more protective factors, like a caring adult that's in your life, a safe environment, right? You can afford additional resources, the more likely you are. It doesn't mean you cannot overcome the risk factors, right? You can have someone from a single parent household, poverty, who does really, really well, right? Like an athlete, like LeBron James, let's say. But we're talking about how do we increase the odds, right? And that means we have to be intentional with the application of diverse solutions. No one strategy is going to meet the needs of all 30 students. Some students need tough love, right? I used to coach competitively, right? And so, yes, organization is strict, but some of my students, my not so great athletes, I had to actually ask questions like, what are you thinking, right? What's going through your mind? They needed to get some more caring love. Once again, different approach, but it was to get the best out of them. And I think that's some of the approach we need, a bit of a place-based approach to meet the needs of diverse schools and help them with increasing test scores. I taught middle school, right? And I know test scores have become very, very popular, but I can teach to the test and get all your scores up, right? I can take all the practice tests from the year before and teach to the test the whole year, but is the test asking us the skills we want our students to learn? Particularly now with AI, right? So that's something we have to reevaluate to think about. I started talking about some of this language, right? This is kind of the language I'm using in my recent research around creating thriving communities. And I use the example of the achievement gap. We talked about a lot about that. EQAO is a big deal, right? The test scores. But we have to talk about the opportunity gap. Because if we give folks the right opportunities or the fair access to it, they're going to do well. So the achievement gap is the destination, right? It's measuring where are the differences. But this discourse is not talking about the causations of these differences. Where the opportunity gap is saying what is actually causing this difference to exist. So let's go back. Is it the early years? Is it the way we're teaching? Is it the values of the education system, the policies? And one spot in this line, in this journey is going to have all the answers. So we need some people to do policy work. Some people to make the community safer. We need the nonprofits to support those families outside of school hours, right? So I talk about continuity of care, where like, it's not just what happens in the schools, it's what happens outside of the schools, right? And good teachers build that relationship. It doesn't mean dismiss the curriculum. I was a teacher, I still teach the curriculum, but if I only focus on the curriculum and you don't feel like you belong when you walk into my classroom, then you're not likely going to listen to whatever I'm going to teach you, right? So that's where I say you need to merge the two. The rat park test is really interesting. So essentially, when they were testing rats for addiction. And the rat is running on the spinning wheel, and they had one hose that was take the drug in the water. And when they did this test, most of them ended up becoming addicts. Years later, psychologists said, what if we put the rat in a rat park? So they're not just running on this wheel, and this option A is the water or the drug. They can go and exercise, they can go and play with toys and some other things. So they changed the environment and they had more options, right? And when this happened, most of the rats didn't become addicted. So the connection piece is really, really important, right? I mean, think of the real life example in this video, if you Google it, the rat park test, is when they said when the World War veterans came back, right? A lot of them were doing drugs while they were there to forget all the negative things, killing people, all that. Well, they expected many of them to stay drug addicts, but no. When they came back home, they went to their families, they wanted to kind of experience all those new things, so they didn't become drug addicts. So the environment impacts your motivation and your engagement. I'm not saying you should focus only on students' motivation or environment, but I'm saying you can't dismiss that as an important part of effectively developing learners and students who are going to gain the critical learning skills to do well and thrive. So I was trying to come up with some of the challenges. We only had 10 minutes. I didn't have as many slides as you, but here are a couple of things I thought are relevant in our current context, and maybe with the Q&A or the questions that come up. In the EDI, we talk a lot about systemic racism or discrimination. For me, it's not from a place of, let's make people feel guilty or give them a handout. Here's how I read it. Any system is as good as its weakest link, or how it treats its most vulnerable people. And it affects everybody in the school community ecosystem. Ecosystem is all about relations. So to give you some statistics, one homicide in Canada costs taxpayers $6 million in direct and indirect costs, from the police that shows up, the ambulance, missed work, all of those pieces, right? So if you can reduce violence in the community by focusing on the homeless, the people who don't have housing, right? It actually makes the community safer for everybody. Property values go up, people are more engaged, there's more sense of community, right? So when we focus on specific population and their needs, I don't think it's a handout, it's about how do you create the conditions for everyone to thrive, and when you do that, everybody benefits. Because lots of studies has proven some of the most diverse companies and corporations are making the most profits now because of that, right? Because everybody benefits from some of those conversations. When you have mixed ability groups, it actually elevates the group, because some of the higher expectation students are gaining leadership skills by mentoring some of the younger or the slower learners, for example. All right. So we use a lot of that language, disproportionality, but once again, for me, it's about not the outcome. Let's look at the processes, right? And some of that is looking at delivery of the curriculum, the content, and the policy. For example, we went from, when it came to punishment in schools, we went from 0 tolerance, right? Which is like, you did this, you're suspended, right? Then we recognized, well, there was a lot of subjectivity of, well, who decides? There's an overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous students in special education, specific IEPs related to resistance, right? So we shifted to progressive discipline as a policy, which is, well, let's document, give them a chance, you talk to them, you involve the parents, and if you do all of things and they're still not showing improvement, then maybe it's suspension, right? So we shift strategies over time, but I agree we need to be data-driven. And just because something is a policy or a law at a specific context, it doesn't mean it's the best. Because at some point, the law said segregation was the best thing, okay? So we need critical thinking and we need changes to sometimes reevaluate, are we meeting the needs of the people, right? It comes back to that for me. Some of these other pieces, I've kind of tried to recap them, but culturally irrelevant curriculum, right? I think you mentioned a lot about the what of curriculum. For me, some of this is around the how of curriculum. You could have the best curriculum, but if I just say, okay, read it on your own, I'm gonna test you, versus how I deliver it, it makes a difference, right? We all have different learning styles. Some of you learn by being kinesthetic, some of you learn by reading, some of you by writing. Doesn't mean one is better than the other, but am I making an effort as an effective teacher to provide you with some of that flexibility for you to then learn the material? I have to be intentional, I have to get to know you a little bit. And I think that's part of the critical pedagogy as the how and the art of teaching that is important. Mental health and well-being, resistance to change. I think right now we're dealing a lot around digital and economic inequities, right? AI has some really great things that's happening supporting students with special needs, right? Text-to-speech, a lot of those tools. So we also have to adapt with the times around, some people are focusing on cheating detection with AI, okay? for me, AI is here to stay. Whether we like it, we don't like it. So how do we use AI to actually teach our students skills, right? So for me, Wikipedia example, when I was teaching high school, you weren't allowed to cite Wikipedia. I actually had my class go and edit Wikipedia because anybody can, so this they could see, that's not a good, effective way of citing, right? Remember, historically, for the longest time, sharing of information was the problem. Then once we had the printing press and the internet, the problem now is not access to information, it's information overload. So how do we teach them the skills to actually sift through information effectively and concisely and make an argument or a case? So there's the article Jeff wrote, which I thought was great from our event last week, and then it was on the front page of the Waterloo Record on Saturday, and someone emailed me and said, we need the best teachers in the school, not the most diverse. And I wanted to write them and I said, I agree, but obviously it's going to be a long conversation, but I do agree we need the best schools. I actually didn't disagree with the person, but the question was, and this is where I guess when you get into EDI, a lot of people disagree, is what is the definition of best? Do you think right now the best teachers are in our schools? How many people think the best teachers are not in the school? Okay, I think most people can agree on that, which is the outcome. The question is, what is creating the barriers to creating this outcome? So what is it? Is it the faculties of ed recruitment? Is it the content we teach the teachers? Does it start before that? Like, how are we actually motivating certain people to go into teaching? It's all of them probably. And we need people to do a little bit of different solutions, but we all have to put our energy where we think we're going to have that impact, right? Because we want every school and every community to thrive, but once again, one approach is not going to solve all of them. I only got 2 more slides. When you get up, I think it's like, gotta wrap it up. So for me, power is an important piece of it. We have to teach our students curriculum, but you also have to teach them power and how power works in society. So if you're going for a job interview, right, you can know, I'm going to have good communication skills, I'm going to prepare, but you also got to know who's your audience, right? How are you going to dress? How are you going to show up? How are you going to talk? That's not the curriculum. That's knowing how to navigate a system and its expectations, right? But that could also backfire. So I'll give you an example. A former student of mine, they went to a workshop and they learned their police rights. Like if a police stops you and you're not under arrest, then you can keep going, right? You're not under arrest. They're just stopping you and asking some questions. Well, they were coming back from playing basketball, and at the time the anti-gang unit, which was placed in certain neighborhoods, did stop them. And he said, am I under arrest? And the officer said, no. He said, I'm not talking to you. And it started walking. And that actually backfired, where he was handcuffed. The officer said, you're being rude. He cut himself on a knife and said, I'm arresting you for assaulting. I'm not saying this outcome is the fault of the student, but simply teaching someone their rights doesn't mean it's going to solve the problem. You still got to read and react and know where you are, what words you're going to use, and that's part of teaching too, and what we teach our students to become critical thinkers, right? So if I teach this slide, it's not to make anybody feel guilty, but if you do, that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with feeling guilt. But it comes back to how do we understand this to make systems better. It's not about making people feel inferior. It's about the system. It's just like if you tell someone you're racist, they're like, what's the first response someone's going to tell you if you tell them they're racist and they're white? I'm not racist because I got a black neighbor, I used to date this person, right? they miss the boat. We're talking about, when we talk about racism, we're talking about how systems create inequality of access to health. It's a systemic racism part, right? It's not an act of meanness. So regardless if I'm teaching in a higher social, this is my last slide. Regardless of whether I'm teaching university students or elementary students, I know there's a lot of words. This is what guides me in terms of the how of my teaching embedded within the curriculum. And I think this is what I think makes an effective school, an effective community, and an effective teacher. I have to find the stressors and also an effective relationship. I have to find the stressors in my students and reduce them. Okay? I got to try to find their unmet needs and meet them, which means I have to build some sort of relationship and trust. Because if you don't trust me, or every time you walk in my class you don't feel like you belong, you're not going to interact with me as a teacher, right? And sometimes how you do that is, you get involved in the school. There's so many teachers that have no idea about the actual community in which they teach. For me, that's very problematic. You have no idea how the lives of the students are. You can teach the best curriculum, but if people don't respect you or think that you care for them, the interaction is not going to grow. And I think that's the part we're trying to merge. And then find the skills that folks are not good at and teach them. If they don't communicate or they have fits, right? You gotta teach them about communicate, express your feelings, right? If they're not good at writing, you're gonna be intentional, but you also sometimes gotta encourage them, celebrate the small wins. So I think being an effective teacher is more than curriculum, although curriculum matters. And I think as an Ontario certified teacher, you are binded by the curriculum. But you also do have some flexibility in the how of what you teach, right? Regardless of what you learn while you're in a Bachelor of Education certification program, you have a lot of flexibility when you get the job and you got your 30 students in your class. For me, the question is, did you make all of them improve during the time you had them? That's what makes an effective, for me, teacher. An effective school, it's about improvement, which goes back to being data-driven. Because you have to not only measure that person's growth, because what do teachers do in September? We do diagnostics, right? Reading tests, writing tests, map out their character, and then progress report cards, right? But also we need to do that at a school level, and we also need that, we don't do enough of that at a community level. What are we measuring at the community where the school is situated? And how do we involve the other stakeholders? Schools will never resolve society's problems. So the question is, how can schools work with the politicians, with the policy folks, with the nonprofits who support those same kids and families on the weekends through sports, leadership, all of those other pieces. So for me, why I came to this event, because I truly believe we need more dialogue. And we're at a stance where there's a lot of division, and we need more authentic dialogue. I don't want to be around people that think like me, but I do want to be with people where we can divide and put our energy where we think there's different solutions. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to have enough of an impact to actually tackle the root causes, right? And I think the conversation has to go beyond ideologies to action. So I put my energy in where I think there's impact, or where I can measure impact. And a lot of it is in the communities that I build trust with. Because if the trust is not there, we can have the best ideas, but it won't be implemented. So the trust is an important foundation. So we need people. There's folks in certain communities, you have trust, we need that. Certain communities, I have trust. There's communities, you have trust. But we have to have those honest conversations, and it's okay if in this conversation we feel angry or we feel upset. That's part of the humanly experience, and that's what we need to make systems better and hold people accountable. All right, thank you. That's for me, and I look forward to it. I'm gonna take your seat. It's warm.
Yeah, so you can see, and it's work.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm going to put less focus on classroom teaching, like Stephen and Ardavan did. I'm going to look more at the top levels, at high-level policy and leadership in the system. And basically, my short answer to this question up on the board is currently in the wrong direction. So here's where I'm coming from, that I'm sensing a new cohort of leaders at the top ranks of the system. I'm talking about directors of boards of education and high-level bureaucrats in the ministries of education. And I'm sensing a sea change in this cohort over about the last 5 to 10 years, but especially in the last 5 years. That increasingly new leaders of school boards, especially in the large urban boards, especially in the GTA, and places like Ottawa too, they're using rhetoric to justify their positions and to declare mandates for themselves that I think is simultaneously highly strident and militant, but on the other hand, vague too. I honestly don't know what they're talking about half the time. So there's terms like that they're going to undergo an educational revolution, they're going to decolonize the system, they're going to disrupt and dismantle it, they're going to totally transform and overhaul it. So we're hearing all these terms. They're often couched in language and terminology from what they call social justice or EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I still find it to be vague. And I'm in the system, I'm in the university, have been for 30 years, and I'm still trying to find out what a lot of these terms actually mean concretely in practice. But I think this is a very important sea change. Take for instance that, you can't read the slide, but there's a new job ad for basically for someone to be Canada's most influential K12 educator. The director of the TDSB, the Toronto District School Board, Canada's largest board. And when you look at this advertisement, sure, there's standard stuff like being fiscally responsible, making the trains run on time, working with stakeholders and stuff like that. But otherwise, the ad is drenched in this kind of language and commands that the person be well versed in it and comply with these directives. And in a second, I'll say why I think that's not the best thing. Basically, what I worry about is the lack of evidence for these sweeping calls for change. This new cohort of leaders, they portray the Ontario system, and I'm thinking the Canadian systems across the country in general, from say about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, circa 2012, 14, in very harsh tones that it's a highly oppressive system, that term is used, traumatizing and things like that. But if you actually look at the big picture of how the Ontario system, for instance, was performing at that time, it was actually pretty good by most international and historical perspectives. That is, the levels of funding on an international scale was pretty healthy. Maybe it wasn't sufficient in a lot of cases, but overall, it was a fairly well-funded system. Student performance, if you go by test scores like PISA, as Stephen mentioned, actually Ontario is one of the leaders in the world 10 or 12 years ago, one of the highest performers, and equitable, to use our favorite term, that the socioeconomic gradient for those test scores was actually flatter in Ontario than most other jurisdictions. Socioeconomic disparities in schools are universal. They're everywhere. You know, Ontario didn't invent them, Canada didn't. In fact, we're probably doing better on most of those metrics. Also, the post-secondary participation rate and graduation rates, students flowing out of our high schools into our colleges and universities, amongst the highest in the world. So it was a high participation system, fairly successful in those ways. Public surveys that were done at the time, both at the provincial level for adults and at the board level for parents and students, they gave the system high ratings. There wasn't this outcrying of criticism, most of them rated fairly highly. And I think that reputation spread internationally, that Ontario educators and Canadian educators were recruited to systems in other continents to help guide curriculum, to do teacher training, and often to become teachers and administrators themselves in international schools on other continents. So I think the reputation, both domestically and internationally, was pretty healthy. And this is something, here's an irony that when we were talking, both of our speakers before about EDI, is that as a sociologist who've done all this data analysis for decades on this topic, that the actual school outcomes, achievement and attainment, are really different than the EDI discourse would have you believe. Take, for example, in terms of gender, that for decades now, girls have outperformed boys at the K12 level, grades, test scores, graduation rates, and so forth, never mind discipline rates. And they thrive in universities. So they're now quite a majority, about 60% in our universities. And that's true right from undergrad to PhD for almost all fields of study. Same thing for most minorities. They're actually overrepresented in our universities, especially in our grad schools. This is something that doesn't get played up very much, but that's kind of the truth if you look around and go to our universities. Same thing for immigrant students. That students who weren't born in Canada, came here when they were young, but then went through our system. Once they get over the language barrier, they've done very well and are well above the average, and again, well overrepresented in our universities, especially our grad programs, in our professional programs. So I think there's sort of a strange disconnect there based on evidence between the way that this new cohort of leaders talks and I think the realities on the ground. Now, I'm not saying that the old system is perfect. Like any system, it needed some standard maintenance, some reform, some fresh voices, some new initiatives, some experiments. But I think overall, it's hard to take from this the sense that we need some sort of ill-defined revolution. I just don't see the connection there. So as a result of this disconnect that I'm perceiving between the evidence on the ground and a lot of initiatives that are happening, the talk in the system, that I'm sensing some storm clouds on the horizon. Here are some problems that I would say have probably gotten worse over the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years. I'm hearing this a lot, that student attendance is down, chronic absenteeism is up. In a lot of places, discipline among students is worsening. Teachers are reporting that they feel ill-equipped and ill-supported to deal with some of these new discipline problems. As Stephen alluded to, in recent years, you see some dips in test scores, if you believe they're valid indicators of learning. Also, I think this is ironic, that unions, teacher unions, and also associations like the Ontario Principals Council are reporting that there's record numbers of teachers being suspended and disciplined and sort of put on probation in their jobs. And for whatever reason, who's right or wrong in particular cases, as a development, I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that builds, the vaulted inclusive system that we're supposedly going towards. And I'm seeing this. We were talking about recruiting earlier, and a lot of indicators are suggesting that recently there's been dips in the ability to recruit people into the system. So that, for instance, and I can vouch for this at my institution, that people applying to go into the principals training program, applications are down. Far fewer people. It used to be a lot of people want to do that. Now you're seeing fewer. Applications to go into graduate schools in faculties of education to become higher level administrators, they're down. We're having trouble attracting applications and admissions, for instance. So I would worry there that the recruiting is going almost in the wrong direction, backwards in a lot of ways. And I think this is another problem that there's been, I think, increasing rancor disruptions at school board meetings, particularly here in the GTA. This happened to my kids' school board, for instance, where there's been lots of angry parents and that the administrators call the cops and basically have parents removed or blocked from the premises. And again, you can say, well, maybe in some cases they were right to do so, perhaps, but I think overall that can't be seen as a healthy development, as something we want to see. I haven't seen rates like that of school board meetings being disrupted and cops called in my lifetime. This is something that I think has really come on just the last few years. So again, I would just illustrate again that I would worry about this disconnect that's happened between a lot of evidence on the ground and some new initiatives that are being forwarded. Now, let me do some caveats, some qualifications. So do I want to say that every problem that is described, we can lay it at the feet of this new cohort of leaders and its culture? No, I think there's lots of stuff going on. Of course, COVID, school closures and the disruption of lifestyles that it brought, of course, big impact upon students. I think big challenges for teachers and for educators posed by COVID. Likewise, I think changes in childhood culture, cell phones, social media. Our founder of Heterodox, Ardavan Eizadirad, has written a book called The Anxious Generation, finding that those things are having pretty detrimental impacts on a lot of kids, on their mental health and their emotional stability, and I think that poses a lot of challenges to educators and teachers as well. I'd be totally open to people who want to point fingers there and say that our provincial government has hardly been exemplary for the last number of years, and I agree with that, and I'd be totally open to that. And others could say, hey, Mr. Davies, you're exaggerating. Maybe what we're seeing right now is just like a pendulum swing. That maybe, historians have shown that educational reforms go through cycles, cyclical change, and at some periods there's a lot of rhetoric about certain things, and then it shifts back and forth over time. So in Ontario, for instance, that if you want to see a real hippy-dippy approach to education, go back to 1968, the whole Dennis Report, Living and Learning, and it's totally about constructivist learning without that language that has been developed since, but it's all about that. And then, as you know, in the early 1990s, the NDP government brought in more standards through ECOEO and things like that. And someone like a historian might say you see these swings. So maybe what I'm talking about here is since we've gone to one side and it's going to swing back, and in the next few years, you brought me back a year from now, maybe we'll be talking very differently. I'm not so sure about that, though. I think that, unfortunately, we might be seeing a more profound, enduring shift that I think only a more concentrated or concerted effort to correct will be needed to do so. So let me just end on this, that here's what I'm thinking we need more for conversations at the top of the system. I would see a more return to more evidence-based decision-making. 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of work with the Ministry of Education, summer learning programs and learning supplements, and I worry that a lot of that's been lost. It's changed the culture, I think, in a lot of educational circles. One example of that is that, studying trends in student achievement and attainment, that the actual demographic basis of disparities in those things are not so much the kind of identities that are flagged in EDI programs, but really basic socioeconomic status. That's really been true 50, 60 years ago, and it's true now. Also, rural status is a big thing, that it's students outside of our cities who often have the lower attainments and lower achievements. But again, I think it doesn't get enough play amongst this new culture of leaders. I would also say, cut the politicized jargon and the gatekeeping that goes along with it. I know you can't read those charts, but what we've seen over the last 10 years, David Rosado, international researcher, is able to use data mining techniques to chart the rise of different key terms and terminologies over time. And so he's looked at both academic discourse, like journal articles and books, but then also the mass media. And he's able to chart the use of certain terms. In this case, I would say like social justice or EDI terms like, say, trauma or oppression, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and so on. And he's in marginalization and the terms that have now become very popular, intersectionality. And he's able to show that 10, 12 years ago, there almost nobody talked about that. Those terms weren't used broadly, especially in popular discourse. But starting about 2012, 14, all of a sudden you got this exponential rise, in these things. And it became like a new vocabulary, the new way to talk, if you're in educational circles and even in the media in general. And there's no way that the realities on the ground shifted in tandem with that vocabulary. I think the realities on the ground were kind of the same. It's just that people started talking in these new, rather esoteric ways. So I'm not into that. And the reason is that I worry it's used to gatekeep into high-level educational positions. As I mentioned, that TDSB ad, where the ad was drenched in that kind of language, I'm hearing all the time from teachers and administrators that that's how you gotta talk if you want to move up in the system. And I worry that that would exclude otherwise fine educators who would be good at the job, who could be a good director or superintendent, who doesn't feel comfortable using terms that they don't really know what the terms mean. And I'm not sure, as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't know what a lot of these terms mean these days. And I would worry that those who share my feelings would not be given a chance to move up into the system. So I would say that, and let's try to recruit more widely. We're probably not disagreeing on this one. And promote more heterodoxy in the educational world, that a greater range of viewpoints and terminology can be used. And I would also advise that, that high-level leaders in the system listen to the broader public more, and researchers like me too. So have a double whammy going like that. I worry that in recent years, their ear's been trained more towards activists and consultants. I think that that's why they're speaking like that increasingly, because I don't think that's how the broader public is speaking. And that's it. Sure.
Okay, so that was went a little longer than I was hoping, but what I'd like to do is still have a lot of time for the three of our panelists to speak amongst one another. I might maybe just start off with, in the order they presented, maybe posing some questions to one another, and we'll do that for a while. So why don't you start off if you have any questions?
Sure. So I had a lot of questions, Ardavan, about the role that you see education playing. Because listening to your presentation, it sounds to me, I mean, you said schools will never solve society's problems, but your entire presentation was anything but teaching literature, teaching how to do math, teaching science. It was about, you know, how we're going to improve the life of children. We're going to teach them, you know, the skills that they need to avoid the police, or skills that they need. We're going to be their social workers, their psychologists. We're going to deal with their trauma. We're going to fix poverty, crime, social work. Like, I just wonder, teachers are not trained to do any of those things. Like, I don't think teachers should be doing psychology when they have no training in psychology. And, you know, I know the big thing right now is trauma, but, you know, trauma, and I know this because my wife is a social worker and she understands this. Like, trauma-informed counseling is not to like really live in that trauma so that, you know, then you can say, well, I'm marginalized and therefore, you know, on that oppression wheel that we had, you know, before, that therefore, you know, I deserve more attention, or I, you know, or I'm morally superior to the people in the middle, or whatever that is. But it's about that you had a trauma and you have to learn to be resilient toward it, not that to expand upon it. Like, that whole oppression wheel, that to me, I mean, don't you see that as, you know, making education about trauma? And to what point? So that people want a revolution? Like, what? Why that wheel? And who are the white people? Can I have some definitions? And what does decolonize mean? Like, you know, spell it out for me. What is white supremacy? Like, what in education is white supremacist? Like, and systemic racism. Like, tell me which system here in Canada is systemically racist. I mean, I can say that, for example, the university system is systemically racist against males, people with European heritage, people who have less melanin in their skin, right? I can't advance. No one's going to give me a tenure position. No one's going to hire me full time because of the way I look, right? I don't tick the right boxes. And I had to tick those boxes. to get into a PhD program, I had to tick boxes to tell them not only my gender identity, which I have none, because I don't have a gender, because it's a made-up concept. That doesn't mean other people can't have a gender, they can. I have a sex, right? I don't believe that, based on some stereotypes from the 1950s, that's what makes a gender identity, for middle-class America. Because certainly 100 years ago, women worked all day, they got up and, they weren't sitting at home and vacuuming, which is, I think, the stereotypes we work with about gender identity. And they wanted to know my sexual orientation. For what reason? So they could match me up with a faculty member to sleep with? I just, what is the point of this? How is this, where's the children? That's all, I'm throwing a lot at you, but I just.
I'll try to remember all those questions.
Okay, so if I boil it
No
down.
more questions, I want to remember more.
So let me boil it down. So why do you think that teachers should be doing like the job of correcting all the problems in society, number one? And number two, why do you think that fronting oppression is somehow good for children learning?
Okay, so I think every institution in Canada is racist, and based on stats, right? The fastest growing prison population in Canada is Indigenous women after Black males. In our schools, the students who are suspended the most are Indigenous and Black students. There's a similar pattern you see. So, but I don't want to blame, when I say that, I don't want us to read it as like, oh, it's the system's fault. I think I go back to the example of these are disparities that exist. I think we're trying to ask what is contributing to that. And sometimes you could interpret that as researchers from a deficit lens. You could say, well, Black and Indigenous people do more crime, so there's more of them in jail. Or you might say, well, what is causing them to gravitate towards criminality, right? Historically, residential schools, racist immigration policies. So I think we have to look at the root causes at some point in this conversation, and not simply focusing on, well, here are the disparities which exist.
Let me just stop you. What are our racist immigration policies? Because I studied this, and we had ethnic quotas up until the 1960s, and then the government decided that we were going to have colorblind immigration policies, which is the reason why we have a multicultural society and people from all over. And the first group of people to take advantage of that were people from the Caribbean, the African population. We would have very few African Canadians had we not opened up immigration. So what do you feel today is racist about our immigration system, as an example? Like,
Currently
spell it
or
out.
historically? Both?
No, we live today. Like, we're not going to talk about what happened 60 years ago.
So I think the point system that is currently used for immigration, right, is still very tailored to specific things that is not meeting the needs of Canada. So if you need to see, for example, a specialist in Canada, and hopefully you don't because you might die before you see your specialist, the point system is not addressing that. So I think it's a failed system of, if we're bringing folks here, but are not actually looking at how is it going to meet the needs of the economy and the people, that itself is failing. So for me,
So he asked you how it was racist.
Yeah.
how is it racist?
How is it racist?
He asked you how it was racist.
How it's racist
Yeah,
is
how's
it's
the
in
point
the
system
point system that it's using to select who comes and who isn't.
Yeah.
How is that racist?
But what is the race part of it? Like, I understand, I don't disagree that we are recruiting people to come from all over the world with amazing qualifications that should be able to come here and help with millions of Canadians don't have a primary care physician, right? And so we could deal with that, but I don't see the race part of it. Like, what I see is more and more people from all over the world like coming here, and it seems to be like Canadians really enjoy multiculturalism. Certainly when I grew up in the 80s, that we were proud of that. We all grew up in classrooms filled with kids from all different backgrounds and whatever. What is racist? Like, you
So
say
there's
that Canada's racist. Tell me what Canada's doing that is specifically about race.
The definition of racist, a broader term is the discriminatory. That's not unique to race for me.
Well, then don't use that term.
Okay, well then you use any other question. So for me, if I can respond for interrupting, thank you. So for me, the response is, if we're bringing folks but are not setting them up for success, that system is discriminatory because the people we're bringing in, even though they're diverse, guess what kind of jobs they're doing? They're doing the minimal paid jobs
Well,
that are in the country.
there's a real mix,
Let me just finish before, we'll pass the mic to you, not a problem, right? So, you're focusing, or, on the specific of coming in. I'm not focusing on that specific, I'm going a bit broader. From coming in to where you go is where the barriers exist. So, different entry points into the conversation around our analysis, just like as researchers, we had presentations from different entry points. So for me, it's not the coming in part I'm saying it's racist or it's discriminatory, it's how are we then setting you up for success that is the discriminatory part of it. So I hope that clarifies. It's okay if it doesn't.
Well, I think my
Well,
point
that's
is
all
going to be that it's simply not true that all the low-wage jobs are done by immigrants and that Canadian poor people do all the others. That's simply not true. That they're great
I'm not saying all, but
overrepresentation
there's
of
a
a lot of
pattern, lots of studies.
Well, I mean, it was harder 100 years ago. It was far harder. I think that's how, and around the world, in other countries too, that's how immigration plays out. And selective immigration is used around the world. So it's hardly unique to Canada. So.
I was going to say, Scott has done research on, in terms of the sociology of education, in terms of what happens from one generation, the first immigrant generation, and then moving on and where the trends go. And I think that would be interesting.
The three-generation model is around the world. You see that often the incoming generation, they might struggle a bit, and their kids do better, and by the third generation, they've caught up or surpassed the host population. And that's clearly true in Canada as well.
So Ardavan, maybe is there something maybe you could pose to the other speakers? Maybe something about the cognitive science-based learning. There might be some downsides to that perhaps they haven't thought of.
Yeah, for me, it's like, I'm all about the impact and solution. So I think what you presented was a lot of binary. It was like this versus that. So if you had to pick some things you see as a solution to get a specific impact, particularly in education, beyond what you presented as the curriculum content, what would you say? And what stakeholders do you think we need to have to get there? So for me.
So, it's an interesting question because I think a lot of what you presented, and it's not you, I think you're presenting, a critical theory perspective, that a lot of it is just based on myth, right? You talked about learning styles and diverse learning needs. Learning styles are a myth. There's no evidence whatsoever for learning styles. You're not a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner, or someone made that up. Not that long ago, in the 1960s.
I would disagree respectfully with lots of studies.
I'd be very happy, and I know Scott can back me up on this, that it just doesn't exist. And I go into Google. You're the one that,
Howard Gardner at Harvard, he generated that.
Yeah, he generated this theory. There's no evidence behind it. The fact is, we know that actually not just all humans learn the same, but we've now learned that all primates learn the same. So when they teach, for example, simians sign language or whatever, it's the same thing. And we're realizing all mammals and probably all organisms on Earth learn the same, right? There's a model, you have to practice, you have to retrieve it, it's corrected, whatever, it becomes part of your long-term memory, now you can use it. So I actually don't see anything in what you presented as belonging in the education system. There's no training. If you want to go and become a psychologist and then you want to deal with children's trauma, that's not your role. And I would say that about, let's talk about a current issue, let's say the gender identity stuff. And should teachers, go and speak with parents? Should it be hidden from them if kids? Teachers have no training in this, right? Like I look at this issue and I go, well, how do you deal with it? Well, I think how you deal with it is you have to have a guidance counselor in the school who knows how to deal with it. And then you refer the child to appropriate experts who know how to deal with this. And of course, parents are gonna be part of it. And if there's an issue that the kid is in danger because of the parent's reaction, what do teachers do? You call Children's Aid. My wife works for Children's Aid. That's what she does every day, right? That's child protection.
That's a good example of a barrier. So in the Toronto
It's not a
District School
barrier.
Board, there's one social worker for a family of 10 schools who comes to the school 1 day a week, right?
Absolutely, but
So
where's
that,
the funding going? Right, but where's the funding? The ministry, I look at the Ministry of Education, I go, why are there thousands of people working for the Ministry of Education? You would think that a proper expert design curriculum could be done in a year, right? For each subject, you get the experts, you put it together, you're done, right? They come back on contract every 5 years to review and go on. Because we've created this big fat bureaucracy in the ministry, on boards, in schools. Like if you're in a school and you're not actually directly involved with children, you shouldn't be there. That money is wasted. And instead of giving the child who has, autism and that they need a special expert to learn, to give them the best opportunities that they will have to live an independent lifestyle. What do? For mainstreaming, we stick them in the back of the class with a heavy blanket and a rocking chair and a book about cats, right? And they learn nothing.
so sir, what are the solutions you recommend?
So I told you what the solutions are. The solutions are we design a curriculum by experts. We teach pedagogy based on what the evidence tells us about how children learn. Right? And that's what teachers should be trained to do in school. Not about how to overthrow society, right? Which is what goes on in ed schools, or about, let's take a Marxist perspective on society. We're gonna change it. But teachers have a job, stay in your lane. I'm sure teachers would really appreciate going into a classroom going, I feel like I'm an expert. I know how to teach kids so that a year later they remember all this stuff. And then they can move up the next level. I feel sorry for teachers in, let's say, in grade 4, that in grade 3, everyone's doing their own thing. Okay, you do your coloring, you're filling out gingerbread man, you're doing, you're talking about your neighborhood, everything's about me, whatever. Then you get the kids, you have no idea that all the kids know the same stuff. How do you teach the kids anything, right? There's other places in society to learn those skills, but your job is education, knowledge. Is that not important?
So Scott, maybe I just bring you in here a little bit. So what is your perspective on why this is happening, or maybe a little bit of, you seem to have a broad overview of the data. Is there anything you want to probe that the other speakers talked about?
Well, I would just change the tone a bit of the conversation, the tenor. So, it's kind of a 2-to-1 kind of setup here. So I was going to ask.
I came prepared, so.
I was going to ask, though, part of the spirit of the heterodox conversation is that somebody doesn't feel they're being caricatured or distorted, their views are oversimplified. So both Stephen and I, we've sort of taken some aim at EDI, broadly defined. So would you say, was there anything that you thought that maybe we were just getting it wrong, or oversimplifying it, distorting it?
I think there's things I agree with. Like I don't agree with the cancel culture environment we're in, but I think also your reading of EDI is very narrow. Like there's a wide discourse of scholars in the EDI space. So I think your angle is focusing on specific things, which with some of the pitfalls I agree with. It's been applied the wrong way and it has backfired and set us up for that. But I also think, for me, EDI goes back to the needs of the community and the schools. It's not create system where you're hiring based on tick boxes. I think you need, for me, for example, to merge the two is you create a system that has its standards, and if a lot of things are equal and there's 2 great candidates, you might look at some of those external factors, but it shouldn't be at the disparity of this person is not qualified and we're gonna give them the job. So that's when I think it's a wrong application of EDI. But I think, like I referee basketball, for example, and we know like there's less than 10% of basketball referees who are females. Now, if there was deciding who does this finals and a lot of things are equal, I think it's great to put the female referee as a role model to help the next generation maybe consider that career. So that's an example of how I think there's nuances to the work, and I think sometimes some of the things you said was kind of taking complex things and maybe presented it in a simplified manner. But I think the binary argument sets us up, and I know we've had some of this conversation, like A versus B will not create a fruitful conversation. So I'm not on this panel to say EDI is better than this. I'm on this panel to say, how do we work with these different ideas to make schools be better? Because we're all three of us are not happy with it, right? and there's different things we can focus on. So for me, I think we need to continue the conversation, but not from a perspective of I'm right and you're wrong, or this is better and this is not. We can have some of that, but the question is then how do we move forward in a way that can work?
But shouldn't we move forward based on evidence? Like I guess my question to you is, you're talking about, let's put them together. But I showed you, the cognitive science model, the teacher is the center. The teacher is the focus, right? Not the children. The children don't decide what projects they want to do.
So I think
How do we combine that?
I'll let you answer that quickly, and then I want to sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's studies that show the teacher-centered is better and sometimes the student-centered is better. So for me, like, you need the respect of the teacher, the curriculum, all that, I don't disagree with, but you still need to bring the needs of the students into the process of being an effective teacher.
But the needs to learn.
The needs to,
Isn't the need to learn the information the teacher has and the students don't?
well, I think
What other
the need to learn is, for me, is like the baseline. I don't think anybody's disagreeing there's a need to learn. But I teach in some of the you brought a great example of a lot of this is socioeconomic status, right? Like, I could want to teach and do the best for my student, but if my student doesn't give a shit about education, it doesn't matter what I do. They're just not gonna do it. So how do we bridge, for me, the question, how do you bridge the gap between that student who doesn't care, they're just coming to school because they have to. So how do we bridge the gap for that student?
What about failing them?
Sure, we can fail them, but they're still not gonna solve that student.
Well, you
All right,
might.
you know what, I think I wanna have, there's gonna be a
Sure.
lot of questions, I'm
Sure.
sure, this has been a very divergent panel, so, looks like Chloe. go ahead.
Well, I just want to point out there is an evidence-based example to look at. About 10 years ago, Catherine Barbelsing in England, in one of the lowest socioeconomic areas, I think Wembley, started the Michaela Community School. It's old school. The teacher is the authority, the teacher is the expert, the chairs sit in rows like this, there's no communal workspace, uniforms. She set her bar very high to the point where there was a ton of pushback. I mean, she's put up with a lot to go against the norm of, these critical approaches. She went right back to the canon of English literature, classic liberal education. These kids come from diverse backgrounds, many from difficult family situations. That school is now the #1 school in England. And every one of those students is proud to be there. And so, yeah, they might have walked in the door, as you say, not giving a shit about education, but the example set by the teachers and the expectation and the bar set made them care and gave them something, gave them purpose and meaning, where maybe at home they didn't have anything. But now they were told, you know what, you can shoot higher, you can aim higher, reach higher. And they did, and they're the #1 school in England. So show me an example of a school that took a critical approach and has achieved the same results as what Catherine Barbelsing has achieved with Michaela.
There's 2 teachers right behind you that can give you an example.
Yeah, so tell me an
Yeah, I
example
mean,
just
it's
like
wonderful to
that.
have an example like that, and I'm sure over 10 years, you can create the data, but I'll tell you right here, my personal example is a great example of how Ardavan's beliefs, a teacher who looks at me and says, you can do better with at home, that's not what I expected. Somebody that was consistently providing me support, comfort, understanding, saying, hey, it's okay if that's happening at home today. When you come here, we're gonna do it like this. How about this project? Does this work for you? And as I pushed forward and had somebody supporting, I was able to see myself beyond what my my family and my cultural expectations were of me, and I've been able to continuously, to this day, persevere past that.
How is that different than what I just described?
Well, you described something, when I said high expectations, you described a very rigid system, that was the reason why this system was successful. I didn't have a rigid system. I had a teacher who said, hey, I'm glad to see you here today. How's it going?
All right, so I'm just gonna, do you have a question for the panel? Would be great. So I think I saw.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's great, I don't think anyone's disagreeing with any of that. I thought we were here to talk about specifically DEI and why, and how that's beneficial. All these things are really important, right? But you're saying to get to the core issue, why aren't we talking about fatherless homes? Why aren't we talking about socioeconomic status?
Gangster
Why-
culture.
Why aren't we talking about those things as the issue and not the skin color and where they were born? And what does any of that have? You didn't mention any of that in your presentation. And in fact, in the beginning, when we were talking about DEI, you actually did say, let's replace DEI with the best. You can't do that. Like, we can't just take a word and then change it because we want to. Like, there's meaning to words for a reason. You're using the word racism, and then you said, you know what, like, well, it's not racism, it's, it's prejudice or whatever it is that you use. Why aren't we using terms? And now I'm a mother, and I have 2 children in the publicly funded school system, and I wanted to hear why racism is valuable in our schools. We are hiring people who do anti-racism courses, who train, I would imagine, people such as yourself and other people who are certified. And I'm gonna just read this really quickly because I thought we were here to talk about anti-racism, okay, and DEI. For over 50, this is someone who is with our taxpayers, our tax money is going towards these consultants, okay? For over 15 years, I've had to endure the impacts of being in white feminist spaces in the yoga and meditation community that has been co-opted by whiteness. I've listened to the relentless narrative of white women speaking on all their daily affirmations they repeat to help them attract and manifest good jobs, beautiful homes, new opportunities, health, relationships, peace, and of course, positivity. I'm almost done. But I've never heard white women share their daily affirmations for dismantling white supremacy, oppression, and the daily harm they consistently or consciously or unconsciously perpetuate in the world, whether at the grocery store, the doctor's office, while traveling to Black and brown countries, or while sitting in work at a work meeting. What would it look like if your emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual rituals and hygiene also included dismantling the harm that white womanhood, in particular, perpetuates through daily affirmations? How is that not racist?
I'm not sure what your question is.
My question,
I think the understanding is targeting an ethnic group, I think, as
Yes.
some sort of oppressor. Is that not racist? I think in that is the changing definition.
I think you have to ask, in that context, I'm not familiar, but I think the conversations around equity, which, to your first point, I want to respond to your first point, EDI is not about race. Not for me. It's about all aspects of identity, right? Race gets centered a lot, but equity is about meeting the needs of different people, right? So in this context, it sounds like somebody clearly feels like they're not being valued or seen on the basis of race, in the yoga sector, for example, right? So the question becomes, why do they feel that way? I don't think, if you read that to me, I don't read it as someone trying to create division. Somebody is saying, I'm not being seen or my needs are not being met. Then there has to be a conversation. Remember, I said everything goes back to that trusted relationship and mapping out needs. You can't help somebody or make any system better if you don't know where the gaps are. So for me, it's like this. if you love your kids, you're gonna be hard on them, right? If they do something bad, you're gonna criticize them. And you're gonna say, you need to do better, you gotta learn from your mistake. We have a hard time criticizing our institutions, and many people feel uncomfortable, right? White supremacy is not about race, right? It's about an ideology that privilege a certain way of being. You don't have to be white to be a white supremacist or perpetuate white supremacy. There's many people of color who do it too.
So why use the term white at all in there?
Like
Define it for me.
Barter culture?
I hear it all the time, but I want to know what it means. Like,
Because it does have a historical root, and I would say that's why the white
so
reference.
let me ask you something. Like, is someone from Albania the same as someone from Iceland? Like, do they have the same culture? Did they both do something terrible that, you know, I pulled up, because I was interested in this, that not that long ago, well, we didn't use whiteness, we used Caucasian, or Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. That was the terminology. Of course, all this stuff is, you know, there's no science behind it at all. But, you know, the Caucasoids included people from India, because it's also related to languages, and we know the Indo-European connection. So that makes Arabs, Persians, that makes you a white guy.
Well, I think there's a history there, right? You look at the work of Peter Rushton, who was at Western, who was using race to define and say the white race was better.
Right, but he got pushed out. He's not the white supremacy.
But I'm saying that has contributed to the ideologies.
What's the ideology? I'd just like an explanation.
And I think
I don't know what
it
it
is
is.
evident if you look at all the system and who gets access to opportunities.
Well, certainly
As a pattern,
certainly at our university, it's not white people, and it's certainly not men. So I mean,
Okay.
what is the ideology?
Are there any questions, maybe from any students have a question? Or maybe not? Okay, how about,
So, I mean, I want to pick up on what Stephen was saying, which is this thing about people staying in their lane. I think we've had an understanding scientifically that whether it's society or nature, that things are complex systems. And that perturbations to some little element to it can cause chaotic chaos, especially when it doesn't belong. And so to Stephen's point, teachers are not trained to be social workers. And implicit in all of what you had to say tonight, Ardavan, and you probably aren't even aware of it, implicit in that is a sort of cultural discourse which is disparaging to me as a father. It's disparaging to me as a parent because you think, correct me if I'm wrong, and this is where the question is, you think that somehow you're more equipped to teach my children about how to be successful, whether my child is black or white.
I think you're wrong, because that's not what that's, if that's how you read me, I'm sorry, but that's definitely not. I think every parent, sorry, I just want to clear, you said that was a question. Every parent should parent their child however they want. I don't think I'm better than that.
But implicit in this system, in the educational system, it's cost me $18,000 because I had to pull my kids out of it, and their school has doubled in, by people walking out of the public system, it's doubled in enrollment, as is every other private school in Niagara. It's doubled because parents are saying, I can't send my child to school without a teacher who's been trained that they're the parent, getting to tell my child what values they should have. I can't do that, and so I have to send my kids somewhere else, or homeschool them, or go to board meetings and fight. And I think that you're not aware of it, but this discourse, you implicit in everything you said, was a kind of condescension towards parents that somehow teachers like you are so highly educated in social work, which you're not, that you get to tell me that I'm wrong and that you're gonna add to the kids. And I know you're saying you deny that you said that. I would like you to think about my comment, because I think you're not aware of what you're thinking. That is exactly what's happening in operational terms.
Oh, thank you.
we have a question at the back there.
Couple things. I think one of the questions I have for you is the concept around the change that has happened in the growth of women in school, all of those things, none of that happened until there was a revolution. None of it. Over the course of time, that's what's happened. Education has caused revolutions, and we've had multiple revolutions over time that have allowed people who have been oppressed, I'll use that term, who have allowed people who have been oppressed, whatever the reason has been, in multiple places around the entire globe to move forward. That's what's happened. And so, and I think in all of those times, there have been people such as yourselves who have rallied against those pushes that have needed to change. And I think we're at that crossroads right now, in that people who are feeling that they have been oppressed are saying, we need shifts, we need changes. Women couldn't vote. Black women couldn't vote. Every time we've had a shift, it's been because there's been a group of people who have said it needs to change. And that's what education has done. So every parent has exactly that right to teach their children how they feel is appropriate. No one is disagreeing with that. But what I find I'm struggling with is this concept of it can be this way or it can be that way. Why can we not focus on EDII and focus on what you consider to be the evidence-based, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it's all together. You're gonna find evidence for whatever you wanna find evidence for. That's just how it works, right? And so I think we have to stop focusing on this person said that white women are bad, this person said that black men are bad, and we've got to come together and say, okay, how do we move forward in a way that allows everyone to reach where they need to reach, rather than this constant, you are against me because you're trying to move yourself forward. Because that just has to end. We're not getting anywhere, right? So the whole conversation needs to focus on what happens in schools that allows everyone, and not just the folks who are doing really well.
Do you
I
have a
say
question
this all
on
the
that?
time.
I did hear a question.
Okay,
I did,
okay.
and I thank you because that's a great question. So I want to start at the beginning. I don't think any of those changes happened because of revolution. Those changes happened because of liberal, classic liberalism. Right?
It has
The
changed
let me, I'll ask your question and then of course you can respond. The idea behind classic liberalism is the idea of the individual dignity of people and human rights, right? These were ideas that developed and percolated over hundreds of years. Not perfect, right? And here, I'll do a personal disclosure, I'm Jewish, whatever, I certainly, half my family was wiped out in the Holocaust, right? And prior to that, I don't even know where they came from or where they ran because they would run from, from one disaster to another, okay? So I understand what you're talking about. But the fact was, it was liberal democracy, along with the technological, evolution of society that allowed, right, the first suffragettes, first wave feminism, right? They were saying, they turned around to people and they said, human dignity, human rights. What is different than me in this body than you? Why do you get to vote and I can't vote? That wasn't a revolution. You know what a revolution is? What happened in the Soviet Union.
That sounds like EDI though.
No, that's not EDI, because EDI is anti-liberal. EDI says equality of outcome, right? We haven't talked about that. Equity does not mean equality of access, it does not mean equal dignity. Equity means we want to manufacture that everyone gets the same outcome. That's why we have projects, that's why we have grade inflation. That is the definition, the academic definition. Then what is the difference between equity and equality of access? Now let me finish. Diversity is not about diverse opinions, diverse talents, diverse hobbies, or whatever. It's about these particular groups that we've decided are marginal should be the ones whose voices we listen to. Inclusion means that these are the voices that should be centered. The point with liberal democracy, right, which unfortunately critical theorists tend to look at and they call neoliberalism or whatever, which it's not, the point about liberal democracy is to say that we grow through that evolution of people making rights claims based on those liberal traditions. Women voting came from that. The end of slavery came from that. The civil rights movement in the United States was based on that, right? Those weren't revolutions. I'll tell you what revolutions were. The Soviet Revolution, 10 million killed. The revolution in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, right? With again, their idea, we're going to reconstruct a whole society, millions killed. Mao's Cultural Revolution, millions killed. Revolutions, there isn't a revolution that didn't kill millions of people, that didn't end in disaster. Pardon me?
The American Revolution.
The American Revolution, perhaps, right? But the American Revolution was based on those liberal ideals.
All right, I'm afraid we're really over time, and this could go on endlessly. Maybe we should schedule a part 2 or something. But,
Sure.
So, anyway, I would like.
It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. People want another one. Great.
Keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we should end it here. You said you wanted to keep it going.
Another night.
Another night. Jeez. All right. So I would like again to thank all our panelists. You modeled the HX way. You were engaged. And thank you for the audience for coming. We really appreciate it. I think this is a really important discussion we started. So thank you all. See, we're gonna be.
Oh, okay. Oh, thanks.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that was really good.